Hello everyone. In this video we will continue working through the AddressBook project. In video 2 we started implementing the model, and we created the contact class that represent the concept of a contact and the data and the behavior of the contact. In this video we will work on the data controller concept, or the data controller class, which is the class that will control access to the data, or that will control how the data will look like. Go back to video number 1 if you want to refresh your mind or the memory on how we are designing this application and how we are separating responsibilities between the model, the view, and the controller. So to create the data model, we created the contact class. Every class is represented with two files, one for the header, which defines what other classes can see and access from this class, and the .m, which is the implementation of the modules that are created in or defined in the header and any other supporting modules. The project already comes with an app delegate, a class that represents the behavior of the app. And every view controller has its own view controller class to control that view. So let's go ahead and add a data controller class. So we right click on the project and say new file. And this is going to be an iOS Touch Objective-C class. You give the class a name, and we're going to call this the contact list data controller. This is the class that it's gonna control. The responsibility of the class is to control. It's gonna control the data of the contact list, the collection of all the contacts. This is a subclass of NSObject, and we said every class that we create has to have a subclass, and NSObject is a root class with the most basic features that a class should have. And then next, say where it would go and create the class. So now we have the contact list data controller.h&m. In the header file, that's when we define properties of the class, as well as any instance variables and any behaviors that this class will have. For the properties, this class will have one property, and this is a property to represent a collection or an array of all the contacts in our list. So we write a comment. And always write a comment, say add a property to maintain the list of contacts. So to define a property, we use the keyword property. We give it the memory attributes. And then there are two types of arrays. There is an NS array, which we used before. And the NS array is used anytime your data is fixed, has a fixed size. So in project number 4 we had as 12 files, and this was fixed, so we used an NS array. But for data that can grow and we don't really know how many it's going to be, the NSMutableArray will be the better option. And a mutable array means that it can mutate, it can change, it can grow, and it change its size. Contact list. So this is the name we are giving to this property. So this is a mutable array, and it will be a mutable array of contacts. This is our data storage in this concept. So this loads in memory all the contacts that we have for this app. Now this can come from memory and it stays in memory, so you lose it when the app shuts down, or it can be in a file, or it can be on a server somewhere else. For simplicity and for the purpose of our basic class, we are going to hold the data only in memory, but it's a good extension if you would like to explore using symbol files. And in the follow-up class, the Advanced iOS, we will learn how we can use complex databases and complex methods to store the data either locally in a database or remotely in a server somewhere else. There are 3 behaviors that this controller need to do or to be responsible for. One of them is to provide access to how many elements or contacts are in the list. So we do this by creating a method, or a method that returns an integer, and we can call this NSU integer. And the reason I'm doing this, you will know in the implementation that we are going to use the NSMutableArray method to return how many elements are in the mutable array, and thus that method returns the NSU integer type. So we're just going to use that. The count of contact list give you how many elements are in the contact list. It doesn't need to receive any arguments. The other method that we need to include is a method that gives us the contact at index. So you give it an index, and that method gives you back a contact. Why do we need this? Because you have a list, and we know that we are going to display that list in a view, and the user click on the person they want to see, and it gives them a detailed view. So the user is going to select an element. That element is located at a specific index, and they want to see the details of that element. So we need a method that will give us those details if we give it the index of that element. So this method needs to return to us a contact, and as you can see, Xcode is not recognizing contact. The reason it's not recognizing contact is because contact is not part of the library, so it is not included in the foundation.h file. Contact is something we defined, and it has its own contact.h file. So if we want to use contact in the contact list data controller class, we have to import the contact.h file. So similar to what we did with the library, I need to come here and define another import and say I want to import contact.h. Once you do that, you no longer have an error that it cannot recognize what contact is. Now it knows what contact is. So what I want to define is contact at index, and this must receive an argument. Why it must receive an argument? Because it needs to know what index that is, and to provide an argument you need to specify the type. So we'll use the same type, and it needs to give it an argument name, and the purpose of the argument name is to represent the type. The third use case or scenario or feature that the app will have is to add a new contact. So the user click on the add button, goes to a new view to add a contact, and then comes back and wants to add this contact to the list. So we need to add another method where the user can send a message that says add new contact, and that message receives an argument that is a contact, and we can call that argument new contact. So what we just did is we defined what a contact list data controller is. We said the contact list data controller is characterized by one data element, which is a collection of contacts we're going to call contact list, and we're going to use it as a property so that the Xcode or the library or the runtime would create the messages to set that library, that collection, and to retrieve that collection. Then we need to give or program that controller with some behaviors, and the three behaviors we're able to identify at this time is a behavior where you can ask or send a message to the controller and say how many contacts are in your list, a behavior where you can send a message and say I have this index number 1 or 2 or 3, can you give me the contact at that index, and a behavior where you can send the contact and say I want you to put that contact in your list. So these are the three behaviors so that I can send a message, and you will see in the next video that we will use all these three behaviors from the view controller in order to get that data. So all the messages you have been using so far, they are programmed as methods like this. And in programming a method, and I mentioned that before in a previous video, and it's also part of the reading from the previous module, it has you define the method by providing a method header ending with a semicolon in your header file or in the implementation. And in the implementation, you, instead of the semicolon, you provide the open curly and close curly brace to define the body of that method. If the method needs to have an access, a dash means you can only access it through an instance, meaning something that you allocate and initialize, and a plus means you can access it through the name of the class. And then it needs to have a return type if it's giving you back something. If it is not, you use void, then the name of the method, then a colon, and the arguments if the method is receiving any arguments. So that's our contact list data controller. Now we move to the implementation. We have three methods here, or that we need to say to implement. Implementing meaning we want to provide the instructions of what the computer should do, or what the device should do when it receives that message. First, we have one property, and as with our guidelines, for every property you need to synthesize that property. So contact list, now I have access to that property. We also need to provide an initialization method. We forgot about that initialization method. And we can add the initialization method in here. And as we did with the previous one, the previous class, we can specify if the initialization method. So what? The initialization method can be the standard init method, or it can be a method that we create if we want to receive arguments. So we can set up an initialization that receives a contact, to initialize the list with a contact, or we can set up the default initialization. Now, if you notice, once I type init, it found init. It found it like this, and you will wonder, where did it come from? I did not define that init. I mentioned before that this class is a subclass of NSObject, and NSObject is one of the most simple classes to implement, and it provides some basic features. The NSObject, one of the features that it provides an init method. So if you are extending the NSObject or using NSObject as a class, and you are fine with the init method, you do not really need to define an init method here. Why? Because an init method already exists. It already exists in the init object. So if you put it in here, or if you don't, it still exists. If you want to change this like we did in the previous video and say init was first name, last name, and so on, then that doesn't exist in NSObject, so you have to provide a definition for it in the header so the user can use it. But the init already exists in the header, and if you want to change it, and we'll see that we could change it, you can use that in the implementation directly. So what you see in the header file is all the properties and the method that is defined in your class, but that is not the only thing that your class has. Your class has what you define in here, and it also has anything defined in the class that you are extending, or in the class that you are a subclass of. So when you start using that class in the view controller, and you wonder what kind of messages I can send to a contact list data controller, you can use all the messages and tasks that are defined in NSObject, and all the messages and tasks that you defined yourself in your header file. The NSObject header file exists in the foundation.h, and you can look it up to see what tasks should be there. So you're never limited to the tasks that you add. You always have access to the tasks from what you extend. Alright, so let's implement these methods, and I am going to take the init out from here, and because we don't need to duplicate it in here, but we are going to override the definition of init, because we want to say what is the initial contact for that list would be, and we also want to initialize that array at least. So let's see how we can override that init. So if I start typing init, you see it exists, you hit enter, and here is the init method. And anytime you use an init method, you have to initialize the super, similar to what we did in the previous video. So I will say self, because that's what we're initializing, and send the message to super, say init. And you check if the initialization was correct. If it is, then yourself will have something, and then you put the instructions that you want. If it is not, then you return nil, and part of the statements here you say return self. So this is the standard structure of any init method that you want to use. And if you want to write your own initialization instructions. So in our case, we have a property that's an array. So I need to allocate and initialize that array. So that's the least that is needed here, is to send the message to the NSMutableArray and say, I want you to allocate memory for my array, and I want you to initialize the default initialization of that array, which basically sets a default size. So allocate and initialize sets a default size for my array. So that's the least that I need. You will see in a minute that we would also want to add some default values. So this array is now empty. So if we call on this to say give me the contacts and so on, it's going to give me back nothing. So I want to at least add a default value or initial value. You know, when you get your phone for the first time and open the address book, it doesn't come empty. It is loaded with some like the manufacturer's phone number, the wireless provider phone number, and maybe several other famous phone numbers that you find already loaded. So we want to do the same thing. So in order to add something to the contact list, I need to add a contact. So because the contact list is made out of contacts, so you will see here how we can create a contact object and initialize it to a default value. And we're going to use that with a default value of our own name. So to create a contact object, I use the type. So here is the contact type. And then I can say initial name and send the message to contact and say allocate. Now, if you remember, we did not create this allocate method. It was there because we extended the init object. But what we created was the init method, and the init method, if I say initial name equal, init method had a dash. We had a dash next to the init method, which means you cannot use the class name for it. You have to use an instance name, something that's allocated like initial name. Now I can say init, and you can see there are two init. If you recall from the previous video, we only created the second one, but the first one comes from the NSObject, so it's available for you. The second one, here it is, and it requires three values. A first name, so we're going to put a default first name, which is yours, and we're going to put a default last name, which is put yours, and then a default email address, and I'll put my email address. So that initial name now is a contact created in memory. I want to add it to the list, add the initial contact to the list. So I will say I call on the contact list and send it a message. The contact list is an array, so it has a method that says add object, and you add the initial name object to your list. So what I did here is I initialized my property, and I added a default value into my property. Now the init method was not here. What I did is overriding the initialization of my NSObject, a method from the NSObject. So let's go ahead and work the things that we created. So provide an implementation of the contact of the count method. So start type, put dash and start typing count, and you will see the method that you declared in the header file. Hit enter and it would list it for you. Don't retype, because every time you retype you're gonna make some errors. And all what this method does, it returns the number of contacts in the array. So the array has a message. So if I say contact list, and it has a message that says count, and that gives you how many elements are in the array. So all what I need to do is to return that count. And that's all the implementation needed for the count method. Now we move on to implementing the contact at index. So the type dash and then say contact at index. And instead of the semicolon we used in the header file, we're using the curly brace. And again, there is a message in the array that says object at index. And now notice the type at the object at index, NSU integer. That is the reason I used NSU integer here, so I can use that directly. So I can use my argument and pass on, this is called passing the argument to the message object at index and return whatever result that comes out of it. Then the last message that I have is the add new contact. The add new contact. Again, you just start typing add new contact, and here it is, and then provide the body of the method. And the add new contact receives the contacts and add that contact to the list, which is very similar to the add object, which is what we have done here in the initialization, and that's what we'll do. So we'll say to contact list add object, and that object is new contact. So that's all the implementation. As you notice, since we are relying on the library NSMutableArray library, we can use the messages and the methods from that library to perform almost all the tasks that we need here. If we were so that's that implementation. Now a note about saving and where the contacts come from. If we saved those contacts in a file, or if those contacts were in a database, or if those contacts were, let's say for instance Facebook, let's say you let the user log in and you want to initialize with the contacts from Facebook, what will change in this is this part. Instead of creating our own, as we say here, hard coding, instead of hard coding the initial contact, we will write instructions to open a file and load the elements from the file, or connect to a database and load from the database, or connect to an external service like Facebook, Gmail, Twitter, any of those, and load the contacts from that service. And that will be here. Probably it will be too much, so you may write your own modules, and maybe you will have either a library that you're using, or you may download some libraries from the external service to use to do what you want it to do. All of this is discussed in the follow-up class, the Advanced iOS class. So we will stop here, and in the next video we will move to the view. We're done now with the model. We created both the contact and the contact data controller. So now we need to go to the view, and we already have one view in our app. We may not need it, so we could we're probably going to delete it and add the view and introduce you to the table view controller. We'll do that in the next video.